We start by making the narrow part of the button band, the one that is closer to the edge of the fabric. Work half of the stitches of the button band, and if you're working in one-by-one ribbing like I do, it is best if you stop after you make a knit stitch. This is row 1, these 5 stitches that I've just worked. Turn your work. Slip 1 stitch purlwise. If it is a knit stitch, then keep the yarn at the back of the work. If it is a purl, as is the case here, then keep the yarn at the front of the work and slip the stitch purlwise. That means we insert the tip of the right needle into the stitch from right to left. Then pull the yarn a little bit to tighten this stitch. This will make sure that the edge of the buttonhole is nice and tidy. And then continue to work the stitches of the button band until you get to the end of this micro row. So I'm gonna work in simple one-by-one ribbing, but it could be any stitch pattern you like because this buttonhole looks nice on all stitch patterns. Turn your work. Row 3. We work all stitches of this narrow part of the button band again, and then we stop because it is very possible that our buttonhole is long enough. To check whether it's long enough or not, we take the button and place it at the bottom of the buttonhole in the spot where the stitches were split in half, like this. And now we see whether the piece that is underneath the knitting needle covers about half of the button, about over half plus, let's say, of the button. And in this case it does, so that means that my buttonhole is long enough to fit this button, and I'm gonna stop here. If it's not the case in your project, if the buttonhole is still too short, then repeat rows 2 and 3 one or more times depending on how big the button is. In my case, that's it. I'm gonna stop, and then we move to the second step, which would be the transition between the narrow part of the button band and the rest of the project. To make sure the button hole is not jammed over here, we're gonna make yarn overs. And to decide how many yarn overs we're gonna make, we need to take a look at the left side of this narrow piece and count the knit stitches over here. In my case, it's 2 stitches. See, 1 stitch and then the second one, and that means I'm gonna make 2 yarn overs to transition to the other side of the project. So I'll make 1 yarn over and then another one. Now these stitches are gonna stay on hold. We're not gonna work them for now. We're gonna move to the second part of the project, which would be the rest of the button band and the rest of the project, which is represented over here by these 4 simple stitches worked in stockinette stitch. And then we work on the rest of the stitches of the project. If it is a wider project, of course you'll have more stitches, but you work them all in the established pattern, the one-by-one ribbing in my case over here, and the stockinette stitch for the rest of the stitches of the project until you get to the very end of the row. This was row 1 for this side of the buttonhole. Turn your work and then work all stitches again, the project and then the rest of the button band, until you get to 1 stitch before the yarn overs that we made in the previous step. And for me, it's gonna be over here. So I have 1 stitch and then the yarn overs, and that's when I'm gonna stop. Now we're gonna work this stitch together with the yarn over. If it is a purl stitch, then we would bring the yarn to the front of the work and simply purl these 2 stitches together. If it is a knit stitch, as is the case over here, then make a slip, slip, knit, decrease. You can do the classic way, but I prefer the simplified version. So I slipped 1 stitch knitwise from the left needle to the right needle, and then return it back, and at the same time I push the right needle a bit further to get into that yarn over, like this, and knit these 2 stitches together through the back loop. This was row 2 of working this part of the button band. Turn your work. Slip the first stitch purlwise, and if it is a knit, the yarn would be at the back of the work. If it is a purl, as is here, the yarn is at the front, and then we simply slip it purlwise like this. And then pull the yarn a little bit to tighten the stitch and make sure the edges of our buttonhole are neat and tidy. And then continue working on all the rest stitches of your project, the button band and the project itself, until you get to the end of the row. And this would be row 3 of this side of the buttonhole. If you worked rows 2 and 3 of this side of the buttonhole more than once, then continue working rows 2 and 3 of this side of the buttonhole again and again until you have the same number of rows over here as you do over here. And at that point, you need to have one yarn over left between these two parts of the buttonhole. That's when we move to the last step of this, of making the buttonhole, and finish it. Turn your work. And then work all stitches in the established pattern until you get to one stitch before that last yarn over. And then work this last stitch together with the last yarn over. And again, if it's a purl, we'll do a purl two together. If it's a knit, we'll do an SSK, a classic version, or a simplified one for lazy people like myself. And knit these two stitches together through the back loop. That's it. And then continue to work on the narrow part of the button band to finish this row. After all these micro rows, we made a lovely buttonhole that blends almost invisibly with the texture of the ribbing, but it also looks very nice and neat on any other stitch pattern. And this buttonhole is not just neat, it is also the right size, which is the main thing, right? It should fit the button, see? And it also looks exactly the same on both sides of the work. Just look at this beauty. And if you don't stretch the fabric, you won't be even able to see it in the texture of the ribbing. So neat and nice. To get the full tutorial about this method, go to 10rowsaday.com/vertical-buttonhole. Happy knitting, my friend. I'll talk to you in the next tutorial.